Could you imagine driving a tornado chase vehicle that gets sucked into a vortex and goes airborne at least 100 feet in the air, comes crashing down to earth, and then rolls end over end over end, sending you to the hospital with broken ribs, but you live to tell the story? Or perhaps you're hurricane chasing and your car gets overwhelmed by storm surge and stuck in sand. To save your life, you take refuge in an elevated house and end up chilling in a hot tub as part of that story. These are all true stories from freelance photojournalist and videographer Austin Anderson. His are my favorite stories of any storm chaser or videographer I've ever met. You're going to love his stories on these next 2 episodes of the GeoTrek podcast. Austin has so many amazing stories, we could not possibly cover them all in one episode. So we're doing a 2-part series with Austin Anderson here on the GeoTrek podcast. Hey everyone, I'm Hurricane Hal, host of the GeoTrek podcast, where we explore the world to tell stories about extreme weather and natural disasters not covered by the mainstream media. People like Austin Anderson that you're not going to hear their stories anywhere else, but you're going to love to hear them right here on GeoTrek. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow our content online. And don't miss out on our YouTube page. We have a growing YouTube page where you can actually watch our podcast. And a lot of times we'll bring you video clips or photos as well of our guest. Well, without any further introduction, let's jump into episode number 1 here with Austin Anderson. Austin, we're so excited to have you as a guest on the GeoTrek podcast.
I'm honored that you would ask me to help tell the stories.
Austin, I love hearing about your videography work, but let's start from the beginning. Like, how did you become so interested in videography?
It was a case in the 5th grade where my dad was an anchorman for the news in Austin. And I really was so impressed on how the news was being covered, and then he became a professor of journalism at UT. And so I decided by the 7th grade, I'm going to be a TV reporter when I grow up. And so I started working toward that end. And so by high school, I was working as a photographer, videographer, and photojournalist at the ABC station in Austin, KView, and just having the best time. And I worked my way through college doing that. And that was a lot of fun. And I just decided that, well, I could be a cameraman instead of a reporter.
So, Austin, what was the technology like in those early days? I mean, what were you going in the field with?
Well, I'm dating myself, but we're talking about the late 70s. And a lot of TV stations were still shooting film back then. And so the digital revolution, I've lived and shot video for all the formats through those years, from 1978 with a CP16 film camera to a 1-inch tape deck on one side shoulder and another Sony camera on the other side, and going all the way up to Betacam, where it was a life-changing moment for news coverage, where you just had a camera on one side of you instead of the deck to carry with you. So.
Well, in such a different world, Austin, it was like rare to find someone with high-end equipment, right? That could be out there getting professional grade footage.
That's right. And it was a case when working for a television station for so many years, I went down to KPRC because in my career path, it was a case where you go from smaller market to bigger city till you finally get to working as a cameraman for the networks. And I just made that my next goal. And I was at KPRC for 14 years as a cameraman, a news cameraman. And then when I went freelance, I started working for NBC network, and still do today. And that was 30
Austin,
years ago. Yeah.
Let's talk about some of these types of stories that you were covering early in your career. I mean, walk us through, what were some of these stories and what kind of things did you get to cover?
Wow. As a television news cameraman in those early days, there were only 3 outlets, and CNN came along for 4. And so the type of stories that we would cover was everything from politics to house fires and car wrecks, even things that people are putting on social media now that TV stations don't usually cover anymore. And we may have a protest march that we would film, or maybe even like a train car collision. So.
It seems like really a wide range of things. And like you said, social media is picking up a lot of that. But back in the day, if the news didn't cover it, there was no footage, right?
That's right. Just because nobody had a cell phone to film it with, and you didn't know about it until that night on the news or the next day. It wasn't an instant communication system that we have now.
Austin, as I've gotten to know you and heard your stories, the thing that stands out to me is that you've been able to have this knack to get outside the box, find a different angle, find a different perspective that others aren't. And let's walk through some of these stories that you covered with that. I think starting with the 1983 coverage that won you a Headliners Award. Tell us the story of how you covered that event and what happened.
Well, and there was a Ku Klux Klan march and protest in Austin around the state capitol back then. And I was working with Arnie Cantu, one of my mentors at KPRC, and we covered news that happened in Austin for the Houston audience. And when this Ku Klux Klan march started, he said, okay, I'm going to be filming the main part of the march and the protest. You get shots that you think that I'm not getting. And so as the Klan was riled up and protesters were yelling at them and the police were trying to keep a line between the two, I thought, well, I'll just run up in the second floor of this parking garage to try to get an overhead shot of everything. And when I did that, I dropped my elbows over the wall of the parking garage and zoomed down in on the main part of the Ku Klux Klan march, and the police drew a line and stopped the protesters from chasing them to their cars. And at the time, there was more of a protester who was just so riled up and angry that he was pushing into the police line, and they started beating him with billy clubs and screaming, and his girlfriend was getting beat up, and blood was flying. And I looked up in my viewfinder and said, am I making sure that I'm rolling on this? And I was. And so that was kind of an early 1983 viral moment when it went national and made the news all over the country. And I was part of the team, the reporter, Jim Moore and Arnie Cantu. We all three submitted this story that happened with that rally and protest back in '83, and won a statewide Headliners Award for it.
Well, that was a big event. I mean, it caught national and international news. And the gist I get when I hear you tell the story, if you were down on ground level with everyone else, you might not have gotten nearly as good unique footage as the aerial perspective you got from the parking garage.
That's exactly right. And that's part of what makes me want to stand out and do a better job than the rest of the cameramen out there, because you have to always be anticipating what's going to happen and think about what other angles that nobody's getting that I can get.
Austin, I think you had shared there was another story where there was some kind of a standoff or something near a ravine. And
oh, yeah.
Going across the ravine to the other side. Could you tell us that as well? I mean, this is another story you told me before.
I spent 51 days on the side of the road covering the Branch Davidian standoff in Waco. And, that was a case where the checkpoint for the media, we established a position on the side of a little farm road outside of Waco that was about 1.5 miles from the Branch Davidian compound, the one that burned and all the people died. Well, 51 days went on where they weren't giving up. And eventually we had our own RV where we could sleep in and monitor the compound 24 hours a day. And we were sitting in the satellite truck one day thinking that we're not getting both sides of the story. We're getting the FBI's side every day, but then the only thing we're getting from the Branch Davidians is when they would hang a sheet outside of their second floor window with messages on them that we'd have to zoom in on a long lens to see. And so the producer at the time, Clint Houston, said, we need to sneak into the compound and go interview him. And I said, oh, that's not a good idea. And so across the barbed wire fence, a flat part of the pasture, was a creek bed They looked on the topo map and could see a way to get all the way up to the compound through the trees, trying to be not detected by, say, a helicopter from the government that's flying, patrolling the area in case they escaped overnight, and using FLIR, forward-looking infrared radar. So Clint said, we're going to use a Mylar blanket over us to try to hide our heat signature. So I said, no, that's a dumb idea. I'm not going to do that. And so he talked a Houston Chronicle photographer into going with him. So they took off across the fence about midnight, carrying their blanket, and they got into the woods, and they got covered with poison ivy first, eaten by mosquitoes, and then you hear this whoop, 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 whoop. He said the helicopter had spotted them. They threw the blanket over their head, but it wasn't enough. They landed and arrested them, took them to jail in Waco. So
they tried to sneak through this ravine at night. They were going to try to cover it a blanket, block the radar. Like you had foreseen, it wasn't a good idea. They got arrested.
No.
Yeah. So obviously they never got where they were going. You're still there on the ground. You're not arrested. So what's your path forward after that?
And so they sheepishly came back to the media compound by noon the next day, saying the judge had just let them go and said, don't do that again. And and so we of course had to interview him about it all. But there were a lot of things that happened, like in that Branch Davidian standoff where when the place caught on fire, there's a documentary where they talk about that. And since I was there in person watching it, it was really a fire that started inside the compound. They had the Branch Davidians had put up bales of hay to protect them from flying bullets through the windows and the walls. And there was some kerosene that was used to catch the place on fire. And because I saw a big black swirl of smoke at about, I looked at my watch, it was 12:08. And we had just finished a live shot saying that they're still not coming out, even though in the morning they were getting bombarded with tanks and ramming into their building. And so the fire department came out, and they stopped at our checkpoint because there were still bullets flying from the fire at the compound, just going off randomly. So they were holding the firemen back. I jumped up on the fire truck with my camera on my shoulder and said, let's go. And it said, oh, well, okay. And then the reporter grabbed me and said, no, we have to go over to where they're going to be processed so we can interview them. So I didn't actually roll in with the fire department, but I almost did. And then went out to where they were, a holding facility where they're going to take the survivors. But there was only one that we saw in 2 hours waiting for him to get there. And he was in the back of a Texas Troopers squad car all covered with soot. And it was just that moment when that Branch Davidian arrived in the squad car covered in flames and soot. And we decided and were disappointed and very sad to realize that everybody died except for that one guy.
Austin, this is an interesting story, and I think it's indicative of what it can be like to be a videographer. It's a 51-day standoff. This is a long-term thing. But then all of a sudden, all this stuff happens in just a few moments. How do you have the presence of mind in that moment to know, like, where do you go? What do you cover? Who do you talk to? How do you figure this out?
That is such a great question, because I liken it to being like in news coverage, like a fireman. You're sitting around a lot and waiting for something to happen. And when it does, you have to have the presence of mind and think about, what do I do next, and not panic. There's so many people that will just let panic in their mind get away with just invading what you're thinking about. And so you have to keep calm and move fast and realize that in order to get the video that thousands of millions of people are going to see, will need to do the best job you can by not panicking.
So you really want to stay calm, focused, and it sounds like sometimes you have a unique path right in front of you. Maybe a way, an angle to shoot that no one else is shooting or something like that.
Absolutely. And a million thoughts are going through your head as so much is going on around you. And a young photographer, I've seen this in the raw video that I've observed in judging for MPPA. They lose track of what they're filming, and pretty soon they can't really focus on what's in front of them. They'll just be here, there, panning across, zooming in, and not staying on the shot, even though it's developing.
So Austin, when you go into a developing situation, whether you're covering breaking news or extreme weather, like, do you have an idea ahead of time? Like, this is my number one goal of what I'm going to capture, and you're going to stick with that goal no matter what? Or are there times where it's more fluid and you shift on what your goal is while you're there in the middle of the event?
Yeah, and I think that's a good question. It's the latter, really, is being able to think on the fly and shift a direction, and not be so dead set on thinking before you go into a story what you're going to be filming. Just be ready to shoot whatever's happening, and understand that you're the eyes and ears for thousands of people.
Yeah, no, that's and I think that's why you've had so much success, Austin, because some of these stories, ways that you've captured things, angles you've had, like, you could not have really planned it, right? It's just, it presents itself in the moment and you take that moment.
That's right. As a teenager, I started working on this ability in whitewater rafting and canoeing. So I'm just going to use it as an analogy. You're in the middle of some class 4 or 5 rapids, and you have to pick your way through so you don't turn over or fall out. And if you panic and say, "Oh, this wave is too big, I'm gonna die," you have to push all those thoughts out of your mind and think, okay, there's the V, I need to turn this way, paddle this way, go this way. And so in a bigger scale, when you're filming some breaking news event, it's always better to not panic and get the shot.
Well, it sounds like you have to, look at your choices and be decisive pretty quickly and go with it, right? And I've been whitewater rafting a few times. I was surprised by how it's not passive; it's very active. You're actually taking an active role in making choices. But I like that analogy because this is what I've seen in your career. You've sometimes had 2 or 3 choices. You've been decisive. You go with it and see what happens.
That's right. Yeah, like you. Everybody was tuned in July 4th of the Hill Country flood disaster. And so at first I was working by myself because in the morning when all that happened and the rain bomb started and news started showing up on my feed as I woke up at 7 in the morning, I'm thinking I need to go up there. In the Hill Country from where I live is about 2 hours drive time. But there was still bad, heavy rainstorms and thunderstorms. So I'm driving through there to get to Kerrville and thinking the whole time, what do I need to show first? And so, of course, I went to the Guadalupe River crossing south of town and was within 20 minutes after arriving was going live for the Weather Channel showing the disaster and also covering whatever else that I could think was going to happen. And that was because of experience. And I covered a similar story, gosh, in 80, 85 maybe, was the Comfort bus disaster where the Guadalupe River once again rose well above its banks and killed kids from a camp who were trying to evacuate in a school bus. And they were plucked out of trees by the San Antonio media helicopters. That was very dramatic too, but I covered all that. So when this happened in July, I knew where to go and what to do because of past experience.
Austin, with some of those breaking stories that are in your home region, do you just get on the road and get out there? And then as you're on the way, you're kind of figuring out who you're going to shoot for, kind of thing?
Yes, that's right. Because I'm a freelance cameraman, I wait for somebody to hire me before I start filming things. Not like a stringer. A stringer will go out on maybe guessing that if I get some good video, I can sell it. But I don't work that way. I work as a freelance cameraman where I'm on the list of cameramen to call on when there's breaking news happening in the area. And I've learned that I'm on the list with enough networks that if there is something that big happening, I just start heading that way and the phone will start ringing. I got calls that morning, July 4th, from CNN, from NBC, from the Weather Channel. And so, of course, the first one that comes along, fortunately, was the Weather Channel. So that's why I started working for them.
Yeah, and it seems like time is of the essence with these. So if you know it's a big breaking story, you just get out there and pretty quickly, it sounds like your phone is ringing off the hook. Austin,
Yeah.
I'm obsessed with the 80s. I love 80s music. I more or less grew up in the 80s. But I just want to ask you about some of your 80s weather that you covered. You had to have covered Hurricane Alicia in 83, right?
Yes.
Imagine.
And
Anything stand out to you about that? I don't think you and I ever talked about that before. Any memories from that or anything that stand out?
yeah, it was the most significant part of that was shards of panes of glass raining down downtown Houston from skyscrapers, and and there were just piles of it in dangerous situation and flooding in the city, and then also the case where Houston's a very low-lying area covered by bayous, and the bayous were all spilling out of their banks, and it happens more than you might think. And there was a derecho, you might have recalled maybe 3 years ago, there where a lot of glass from the skyscrapers filled up downtown Houston, and were piles of it that I was walking across.
Yeah, no, that was a big impact with huge blackout several years ago. I know a lot of
Yeah.
your work obviously was based in Texas. I know you've done work all over the country. As we're recording this, you're coming back from filming a late winter megastorm, a snowstorm up in the northern plains. I want to ask you, though, you mentioned to me one time you had assistance with your friends with Telemundo to sneak across the Mexican border. Was this Hurricane Gilbert, I think, in 88?
Gilbert, yeah, that was amazing, nuts. There was in 88. So, of course, before 9/11, you could get across the Mexican border much more easily. Well, in that case, Gilbert had become, as you might recall, a Cat 5, and it was coming right into Texas, the south end of Texas by South Padre. And all of the media from the U.S. that were covering it, assigned to cover it, from New York and from L.A., from Miami, from Texas, we were all camped out waiting for it in the Fort Brown Hotel. It's not there anymore because this was in the 80s. But I realized just by looking at some rudimentary radar signatures that the storm Gilbert, it was starting to make a left turn. And so I told the producers back in Houston, I was working for KPRC, Channel 2, I said, hey, this storm's starting to go left into Mexico. We should get down there. And the reporter I was working with, Jim Moore, says, well, okay, and let's figure out how to do that. And so we went down to the border crossing in Brownsville. And there was a Telemundo news crew still on the U.S. side. And I said, hey, can we jump in the back seat with you? Because they were going to go across into Mexico to cover the storm. I said, well, okay. And so pretty soon, the reporter driving had a marking on the side of his car, Telemundo. So they just waved him through. And and we wound up in a little bitty town on the east coast there in northern Mexico that just got wiped out. It was like God had taken a hand and just scraped the whole town clear. It was just mud, pigs, thatch roof huts that were on the ground, and people just wandering around like, what just happened? Because they really
that was
didn't
a big
know
hit.
it was coming.
The wind and the surge. I think the surge down there in Tamaulipas was around 13 feet. So where did you actually ride out the core of that storm? Were you in a parking garage in a hotel, or were you?
Yeah, the Fort Brown Hotel did have a protection, but we were anticipating a storm surge, so we moved our cars up to a parking garage in Brownsville. And but after it passes, when we went down there to cover aftermath, just because you can't. It's not smart to go down and wait for a hurricane, especially a Cat 5 in Mexico in a rural area, with a storm surge like in Tamaulipas getting up to 13 feet, because there aren't any parking garages to protect you. So.
Yeah, that is the concern down there. They're not really as built up, and you can get caught. And I know you've done a lot of work with hurricanes. You know very well. I've seen your presentations about different things that can happen with the storm surge. I know on the Gulf Coast. Tell us about your incident in North Carolina covering storms. One of the more interesting stories. I love your from this.
That was in 2003 with Isabel, and Isabel. It was a threatening storm, as you may recall, and it went in the Outer Banks. And so I was working for NBC and asked the producers when that as it was coming in, maybe landfall was going to be 6 at night, and this was about 7 in the morning. The wind was picking up, and I was seeing reports of 12-foot waves crashing into those homes that are on the Outer Banks that are on stilts. I said, well, that would be really dramatic video. We could get down there in 30 minutes and film that and then come right back before landfall. And so the producer said, okay, that's a good idea. So my brother, who was a sound man, Scott Anderson, he and I, in my K5 Blazer, started driving down there. And it was on nice wet asphalt, no sand problems. And we filmed this dramatic video of these waves crashing into these houses, some of them falling down. Well, I was filming out the window of the car and told Scott, I said, okay, make a U-turn, let's get out of here. We had about 4 or 5 hours before landfall. And so as he turned around, he dropped the right side of my Blazer into the sand off the asphalt. And that kind of ground us to a stop. And so we both jump out, and I start jacking up the right side and to put stuff under it to drive back onto the pavement. And that took about an hour, and so we were losing time fast. A small red minivan drove past us. Later, we found out that was a reporter from the St. Pete's Times, because I said, why would somebody else be driving down here? It's all under evacuation orders. And so the wind had picked up to 50 miles an hour steady, and waves were starting to crash over the protective dune layer on Highway 12 and Rodanthe. And I yelled at Scott. I said, go get a piece of plywood off that house over there. So he did, and we ripped it off and threw it under the car tires, jacked it up. We drove back onto the pavement, and by then there was a foot of water, a storm surge, coming in across the dunes. We couldn't see the pavement anymore. So I was trying to stay in the middle, watching a line of telephone poles to figure out where the road went. And we got to about maybe another quarter to a half a mile up the road from Rodanthe, going back to Kildare Hills. And it was getting worse, where some rogue waves were now crashing over the hood of the car. And that reporter from St. Pete was getting kind of nervous, and well, maybe not kind of. He was really scared. And so he said, can I ride back with you all? So, okay, he got in the back seat, and because his van was stuck by then. And the phone rings, and it's the producer. And she says, Austin, y'all should have been back by a long time ago by now. I said, oh, yeah, we got stuck in the sand. We're now rolling again, and we're fine. And I said it just calmly like that. Meanwhile, another rogue wave hits us, and the car goes like that while I'm on the phone. And I hear in the back seat the reporter going, we're going to die. And she goes, she hears that. She said, Austin, are y'all really okay? I said, yeah, we're fine. And then right about when I said that, we hit a gap in the asphalt into the sand that had washed out from the waves and it dropped down, and we stuck up to the axle. So we were really stuck by then. So I tell the guys, as another wave hits us, now it's going over the top of the car. I said, we're going to have to bail out and get back to those houses to survive. And I had taken with me, being prepared is always important in a hurricane, a 50-foot section of rope. So we got our gear together, waterproofed it as best we could, tied ourselves together with this rope, and bailed out in between the waves that were now crashing into the car. And walked back along waist deep water and storm surge that was shooting through the dunes at 15 miles an hour. And then Scott was leading, and he mistimed one of them, and he gets hit by the wave and knocked off his feet. And the next thing you know, the reporter in the middle of us, he gets knocked off his feet. So they're floundering around, and I yell, "I'm not going down." I was talking to myself, you know. And so I took the weight of those two guys on the rope, and they scrambled back to their feet in the sand and on the side of the dune. And by then, that poor reporter, he's on his hands and knees, just sopping wet and tired. And he goes, "Just cut the rope. I can't make it. Just let me go. Y'all can make it back." And so I go, no, we're not doing that. Say, "Here, give me your pack." So we put it on my back, got my camera over my head. And by then, the storm surge was up to our chest. And so we're struggling back, and we make it back to the first house in Rodanthe, go around the back. And by this time, we're swimming kind of up to our necks in salt water and storm surge. And we climb up on the front porch, second story, and got out of the water and looked out. And the whole island across Rodanthe was covered with waves and debris and water. And it was probably maybe a 6-7 foot storm surge. And I looked down and saw a propane tank that had broken loose, was spewing propane as it rolled across the island. And I looked over, and the house in front of us had these 25 foot waves crashing into it. And I tell my brother, I said, "I'm going to go film that. That looks awesome." He goes, "Oh, no, you're not." And so we hid behind the wall on the porch of this house. And he goes, "Let's just break into this house and get in there." I said, No, we can't do that. That's breaking and entering." And he was like, "You're crazy." I said, "Oh, that's all right." And so I looked up on the second floor porch of this house, and the third floor was a hot tub. And I climbed up there in 100-mile-an-hour winds, holding on the railing, and stuck my hand in it. And the water was still warm. The roof had blown off of the hot tub. So we climbed in there to warm up, and the St. Pete reporter took a overhead shot of us with his little camera that wound up on the front page of the paper the next day in St. Petersburg. And it was pretty cool because I'm talking to Scott sitting in the hot tub, and below us you see the island covered with storm surge, with water and waves. And so, and that was a fast moving hurricane. So by 6-7 o'clock, that the water has subsided. There was now a 2-foot section covering the whole island. His minivan was buried up to the front in sand, and we were hungry and thirsty. So we climbed down off the porch, walked over to the minivan. The wind's still shooting at us at 50 miles an hour, and we had some Pop-Tarts, and we're having a picnic in the middle of the sand. And so I look up, and there's 3 staggering figures were headed toward us. And I jumped up to meet them, and they go, water, you have any water?" I said, "Sure, we got some Pop-Tarts too." And turns out these were a Dare County sheriff and 2 Coast Guard guys who had come down in a deuce and a half to rescue us. And I said, "What'd you do that for? We take this into our, as the media, on our own responsibility." And I said, "Well, we thought it would be best," but they had ridden out the storm where their deuce and a half had been turned over on its side, and they roped themselves to the axles to try to survive. And so we, all 5 of us, spent the night in the highest ground that Rodanthe had, which was the water treatment plant. And in the morning, sun was out, beautiful day. We walked back the mile back up to where our blazer was stuck in the sand, and it was buried up to the headlights. And so we started digging it out with a shovel and called a tow truck to come get us, to take us back to Kildeva Hills.
Austin, I always say your stories are like no one else's. I mean, there you are, in a sense, a fight for your life. You end up climbing into this house. All of a sudden, you're in a hot tub, and then my only regret on that whole story is the guys with the deuce and a half didn't come and find you guys chilling out in a hot tub. And they came to rescue you. But amazing.
Oh, I know.
it shows too your heart for footage. You were there, you climbed this house to save your lives, but then you're like, wait, we got some more good footage here. You're always thinking like a videographer, and I could just listen to your story for hours. But along the way, what you're teaching us too is the power of nature. That the force of storm surge, not only with the massive waves and the velocity of the water, but just everything buried in sand and how hard it is to drive a car and all that. And you're just bringing all of this to life for us. Austin, I can listen to your stories for hours. And because your stories are so amazing, we're actually going to do a 2-part episode with you. There's no way we could cover all these in one episode.
Yeah.
Just a little teaser about something really interesting we're going to cover on episode number 2. There's a particularly harrowing weather event that you covered. A little teaser on that, and then we're going to have to wrap up episode 1 here.
Sure. Everybody remembers the biggest, widest wedge tornado in U.S. history so far, the El Reno tornado, 2.6 miles wide. I was picked up and thrown by that tornado and lived. Praise the Lord that I made it.
Well, we're going to get into detail on how you survived that, what we've learned about tornadoes, and you mentioned too when we talked off camera, just we've learned a lot since then, and we're going to we're going to get into detail in episode 2 about how you survived that and what happened. But Austin, we're going to land the plane here for episode 1. This was amazing to hear about how you got into videography, how you developed this passion and a knack for thinking outside the box, and then all these weather stories. You've covered everything from blizzards and hurricanes to tornadoes. You've covered it all, and we're excited to have an episode 2 with you as well. So thanks so much, Austin. We're going to land the plane here and come back with you for episode 2 pretty soon.
Well, thanks for having me over. I sure enjoyed talking to you.